Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for the third in our series from the Sennheiser Sound Academy, Don't Stop the Education series. Today we'll be discussing audio for houses of worship. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I'd also like to welcome my co-host, Andy Edgerton, and we're both from the Relationship Management Team at Sennheiser, and we're proud to have a few guests with us from the US and the UK today, and I'd like to start by introducing these guys. First, at the top of my screen, I've got Brian Gowing, Business and Technology Manager for the Christian Missionary Alliance. Hey, Brian.
Tim.
We have Chris Huff, audio engineer, writer at Behind the Music. So Chris. Oh, sorry, Behind the Music. I watched too much MTV back in the day. Sorry, Behind the Mixer. Chad Kirkpatrick, audio engineer and training manager at Ascension Worship.
Hey.
Hey, Chad. And then Matt Sales, project manager at SFL.
Hey, guys.
Thank you guys for joining us. We're really happy to have you here and talking about the Houses of Worship audio today. I'd like to bring Andy in to go a little bit further and start our conversation. Hey, Andy.
Hi guys, thanks very much for joining us. Great to have you here. I think if we just go around the table, this can be a very informal chat, and we could just, if you could just take a couple of minutes to just introduce yourselves and say a little bit about yourselves, that would be great. Thank you. I'll start with Matt, please.
Hey, so I'm Matt. I work for a company called SFL Group, who are a live technology events company based just outside London. I'm a project manager there, but I kind of have a real passion for how do we help people meet Jesus in churches? How do we as tech people not just push buttons and be cool because it's great things to do, but how are we really making a difference in people's lives? So that's a lot of my focus, is meeting people and trying to work on the why are we doing it, less about what do we do, but more about how do we come and worship and really engage, and therefore how do we use technology in a way that's really going to help people, especially in times like these where people are feeling so isolated.
That's great. Thank you, Matt. And let me jump to Brian, please.
Hi, I'm Brian. I'm the Business and Technology Manager for the Great Lakes Districts with the Christian Missionary Alliance, and I also serve as the National Advisor to the National Office that serves over 2,000 churches in the U.S. My role is to act as kind of almost a traveling technical director consultant for our churches in all the areas of technology. Same thing, I agree with Matt. We're in a unique time where technology and church coincide. I think we're almost at the same point of being able to use technology as when the Gutenberg press came out for churches to be able to share the Bible. And I think it's a great opportunity for churches and they're scared and they don't know what to do with it. So hopefully with this conversation, we'll be able to help them out a little bit.
It's fantastic. Thank you, Brian. And let's jump over to Chris, please.
Yeah, so my name's Chris Huff. I've been doing audio for probably 20 plus years, running the BehindTheMixer.com website for a good 10 years, just trying to teach people, look, there's fundamentals of everything, whether it's basketball, cooking, whatever, just like audio production. I mean, audio is so key in getting, not only hearing the message, but being involved in the whole worship service. So that's kind of what my goal has been, to help people learn the craft. I wanted to be here and help people as much as I can.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. And last but no means least, over to Chad, please.
Hey, I work for a ministry called Ascension Worship. Among many things that we do, we help local churches when they're in need of a sound guy or in need of some sort of training. We also have a YouTube channel called Ascension Tech Tuesday, where every Tuesday, whenever we can work it out, we put out free training videos for church sound people across the world, actually.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yep, really great to have you all here. And I think if we can, I'll start off the first question. And I guess if you can tell us a little bit about the projects that you are working on at the moment, maybe delve into one specific area, and just tell us a little about the kind of team that you're working with, be it an audio team or team within the church. I'm going to jump. I'll start with you again, please, Chad.
Is it Chad?
Chad, sorry, yeah.
Yes. So most of my time lately has been working with a local church that they are brand new to streaming, but they're actually a very large multi-site church. So they want to get the most out of their streams. So we have been pre-recording their worship early in the week, and then I've been able to use my studio experience to go and kind of touch up the recording and get it the way they want before Sunday morning comes around.
Fantastic. That's great. And Chris, what are you working on at the moment?
So right now we've got a team of 4 of us that run audio at our church, but we do a whole audio video lighting setup every week, and it hasn't changed at all from the COVID time period, just because we already do live stream. But our focus now has been on, when it comes to mixing, that it's like we're mixing studio now, because it's, instead of sitting down listening to the houses we mix, sitting down, putting headphones on, and then working from there.
Fantastic. That's great. And Brian?
I've got, in my district, we've got 38 churches, and I've probably been on the phone and assisting about 25 of them. Our church sizes are usually in the smaller size range of 100 and below. Most of them have never done any type of video at all or audio for online. So they're jumping into the deep end and not really knowing what to do. And I've gone anywhere from the range of a pastor just recording it on their phone and putting it online and wondering why it doesn't sound so good, to, we've got the big 1,000 people church that have been doing this for a while, and for them it's old hat, but sometimes they still have questions too on best practices.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian. And finally, Matt, because I know you're at a big rental company, so can you just tell us a little bit about what SFL actually is and the projects that you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, of course. So SFL, as I said, is a live events technology company. We do a lot of rentals, events, all kinds of bits, and then installations in churches. I've been working closely with a couple of churches lately, actually, just as we talked about streaming, what does that look like? Lots of people suddenly are scared. The number of people going, what do we do now? I'm sure the other guys have had the same experiences. And lots of those kind of projects at the moment. How do we help people who probably 2 weeks ago had never been watching this? So how do we make it easy for the 60-year-old lady who doesn't know how to turn a laptop on, or the 15-year-old kid who wants to hack his iPod apart? What's the difference? How do we make this relevant but suitable, that then we're helping them less content, but the technology behind it, and then what's the content? But starting with the question, what are we trying to achieve first? Not what bit of technology we need, but what's the point? And work backwards.
Fantastic. That's great. And I'm going to pass back over to Tim, who's got a couple of more questions.
Yeah, I'm quite curious, just on your personal trajectory, getting to doing audio in the house of worship market. Were you doing audio first, and then stepped up to help at your facilities or your churches, or did you see a need and then teach yourself? I can start with Brian on that.
Yeah, I've been doing sound for 25 years. Started back in New Jersey, like a real small regional sound company that I started back in college, and then kind of stepped away and then started back in. So I was actually in the computer field for a while, and then just happenstance got hooked back in with a church that needed, somebody that knew audio and technology, and then started from there and realized the need. The one thing that I found out is a lot of churches were getting taken advantage of by unscrupulous vendors who saw the church as like this kind of a cash cow. So there'd be churches that I'd go into that really had no clue about the equipment that they had, and were kind of getting oversold equipment. It's pretty much, I love what Matt said about, what do you want to do first? And that's the question I always ask the church: what do you want to do first? So I saw a need for someone to be able to come in with experience and kind of be a middleman, an independent middleman to evaluate for the church and be that help for them. And then just gradually moved into the role that I am now in the district.
Good. Thank you. How about you, Matt?
I freelanced a bit in the sound world, and then I actually got a job working as originally a sound and video assistant for one of the big churches in London a long time ago. So I did 7 or 8 years working for them and developed their whole production team. So going from one site to multi-site to suddenly leading on some bits around the UK, which was quite, and then further afield. And then I moved to an AV company from there. And yeah, so I'm volunteer at my local church. It's 7 doors down the road. It's 250 people on a Sunday morning, but I spend most of my week meeting church leaders doing audio stuff. If that.
Good.
Brian, I think your comment a minute ago is really key. That whole, what do people want to do? And it's not about the latest shiny toy that I got a brochure for, or the latest thing I saw on the internet, because I was somewhere the other day talking to some people, and they're going, we've got this and this. And I'm going, you've got bits of kit here worth thousands of pounds. You don't know what they do. I've got no idea why you own them. How are we going to eBay these to buy the things you do need? Because most of this is a pile of junk to you. It's worth thousands of pounds sitting here that somebody 10 years ago thought was cool. And now it's going out of date before you've actually had a chance to see any of the benefits of it.
Right. Yep.
Very cool. Chris?
So yeah, I started probably a good 20 years ago when I got thrown under the bus by a church deacon who said, hey, we're getting our first soundboard. You're good with computers, right? You can learn how to do this. And honestly, I had always been involved in music in some way. And at that point, it was like fish to water. And I was learning as much as I can on my own. And then after a while, learning from others, and to the point to where I loved it so much and got it and could do it well and start wanting to teach others, because really, I mean, there's nothing worse than going into any type of audio production, whether it's, secular, religious, whatever, and something happens that's just so basic, like you just hear that edge of feedback, and it's not feeding back, but it's there. I mean, it's just that tiny little hum. You're like, okay, how do these people not hear this? Well, they hear it, they just don't know what to do. So the idea is, look, let's just educate people so they understand what they can do so the people in the audience have the best experience ever. And so my wife doesn't have to hold me down in my seat whenever something bad does go happen when we're someplace.
Very nice. Thank you. And Chad?
So when I first got involved into audio, I was at a very small Southern Baptist church, just like a choir, pastor, piano, very few mics. And I would just sit with a friend back there. I wasn't involved at all. It was just another place to sit. And one day I showed up and he wasn't there. And the deacon walks back and says, well, you're running sound now, and just walks off. And so I just had to kind of figure it out. So it was not really planned. It just kind of happened. And then I'm a musician as well. And just over the years, kind of fell into it. When I worked at a music retail shop, and like Brian said, sometimes I'd see people getting taken advantage of, and I couldn't stand that. So I got really focused on how to maximize what we already have, or if you're going to buy something, how to make really smart buying decisions. And that just kind of became a passion for me.
Very cool. I want to say something to all the viewers that are watching. Again, thanks for being here. We know we have some questions coming in, and we're going to start heading towards those questions as we go through. Just wanted to get a little bit of background on our guest and their approach. But one of the questions that we have that is really coming up, and I know this could take up a large portion of our conversation, but I think it's the biggest one, is addressing the current situation we're in, and how you guys are getting your audio distributed, whether it be real time, live, or what your approach is now that there are different restrictions in different geographic locations and countries on what we have to do. And I imagine that's a big topic for all of you. And I'll welcome who would like to take that one first.
I'll hop on if anyone else is
Okay.
Yeah. So through Ascension, I work with several different churches. So some of them are doing it pre-recorded and doing heaps of post editing. And then we also have one or two that are doing it live. And there's definitely pros and cons to each. And just my quick little thing that I've experienced is with the post edits, you'd be amazed at how much more time than a service it takes to get it to the point where you actually want it to be. So it's actually more of a time investment for some of us involved. Whereas with live, you've got no room for error, but when it's done, you can go home and take a nap, which is kind of nice. So, and you're at the whim of YouTube or whoever you're streaming through, and how well your stream's actually going to go through, based off of their equipment. So you got more control with doing it ahead of time, but it also is a lot of work.
Yeah, I agree with Chad. I used to have a recording studio, so it's like you're really doing a recording every week, and you do multiple takes, you stop and go through, so things can get more polished, but it's definitely more of a pain in the neck than doing it live. Live, you're done usually an hour and a half, depends on how long the person speaking is with the overall service, and you don't necessarily have to worry about mixing audio and video separately and incorporating multiple takes. For the most part, that's what I do every week now for the last 3 weeks with my own church. I'm pretty much the one technical director here, and I'm it. And we start the process Wednesday with the recording for the pastor, and then Wednesday evening we're doing the worship, and we record video and audio separately. We take the audio through the board, so then we go through having to match everything up, edit everything down, and then get it set and done for Sunday. And it's usually a kind of a rush. No matter what we do, there always seems to be by Friday, we're pushing the envelope on trying to get everything uploaded.
I think it comes back to that question of what are you trying to achieve? So the question is, do we want the worship to be, it's that balance between performance and authentic worship, and how do we make that happen? Because we can make beautiful, polished Sunday recordings. In the UK, we're in isolation, so you can't gather with people now. So how do I get people who are in different houses? There's been lots of people who've edited what would look like a Zoom call, 9 people together. They've recorded, they've sent a click track. It works beautiful. You can send a click track, and then someone can spend half a night or 2 nights in Premiere or Final Cut putting together a beautiful video. It looks amazing. But is that helping the congregation meet Jesus? I've been working with a couple of churches where they're doing it live, and it's all over Zoom or one of these other platforms. And actually, it's just the worship leader and his wife who's singing as well. He's playing acoustic, but actually, it might not be polished. But in this time, people don't care if it's not as polished. It needs to sound tuneful, and it needs to sound acceptable. But there's a balance of what's acceptable in the current state of affairs. For us in the UK, the BBC are using Zoom for the TV for news. People are on Zoom calls. This is apparently acceptable for the state of everything, if you understand what I mean. So what's the acceptable level, and how do we help also? We're in a volunteer world. How do we help with consistency? How do we make it that this is achievable every week, or start somewhere and grow? Because for the UK, as we come out of isolation, we still might not be able to meet for churches for a good few weeks. But as we come out of isolation, maybe then more people can gather, or with social distancing, people can gather. So maybe we can gather some people, and we need to look at, okay, let's pre-record one song, but let's have some ministry time that's got a live worship leader. So mix it up a little bit. I've done lots of helping people just with, it's so simple for people. Most worship leaders these days have got a sound card, they have a mic and a DI, they can plug their acoustic in, and we can make something sound musical quite quickly. And that's not costing anyone particularly any money or hard to do.
Yeah, I have to agree with Matt too, with a couple of things that, hopefully one thing that people will get out of this is there's not one cookie cutter approach to doing this. Mm-hmm. Every church has its own personality and way of doing things. Some churches, if it's a big church that's used to big production values, putting something online that's like one person is going to seem really jarring. By the same token, on the other side, a small church that's used to having a small, pretty laid back worship type environment, you don't want to take this opportunity to all of a sudden now do a big production value, right? I mean, the one thing I tell churches is whatever you do, you want to be authentic in the way that you've been doing it. You know, don't change the way you've been doing it just for the sake of being online. Be you.
Right.
I will
Chris,
say one interesting side to that. Oh, sorry. I
go
will say
ahead.
one interesting side to that. There are we've got a church that we're working with right now that they meet in a physically difficult space to meet in. And one really cool benefit to them having to go to streaming is that they've moved into a smaller space so they wouldn't be able to fit their congregation, but they've been able to overcome a lot of like room EQ issues and things just from being in the smaller space. So they're actually kind of dreading when they have to come back together how they're going to be able to maintain their level of quality that they've got now in their actual space. So it's going to be an interesting challenge in the long run for that.
Very nice. We actually have a question on room EQ. We're going to come back to that in a moment, but I want to go to Chris real quick for behind the mixer. I imagine you guys are seeing a lot of conversation on this topic specifically right now on how to approach services.
Well, yeah, we are, and I think what we're seeing here, just with the people that we've been talking with, shows the diverse solutions that are out there. I mean, for the people that are, Brian, for recording it before Sunday. Why are you making it so hard? Just kidding. Like for us, like I said, we have a sanctuary. If we get the whole band on the stage, they're easily 6 feet apart. And in the state of Indiana, we are able to they kind of recognize religious needs as places where people could still meet, not as a congregation, but for people like us, for the worship teams to come in and go ahead and do the full thing. So, but we're able to do it live. We've got good practices and kind of safety measures set up as far as sanitation and distancing and all of these things. But that's what we're able to do. That's what works for us. But we also have, we're doing that live, and so that's 2 services on Sunday. But at the same time, on Thursday nights, our worship leader and his wife, who's also an excellent singer, they just do an acoustic set live from their house. So we're trying to meet people at the different needs they have in the different places, but that's what's been working for us, and we've seen great numbers in that.
Very good. Very good. We have a lot of questions coming in here. Andy, have you got one queued up from the list that just came through that you might want to jump on?
It was actually for Brian, and someone is asking, do you have any tips for modifying the room EQ to take into account from when the congregation are then present when you've EQ'd the room when it's been empty without a congregation? I'm going to jump to Brian on that one. That's all right.
Yeah. So ordinarily, when I train people to learn how to mix, I tell them don't use headphones. This is one case where you definitely want to use headphones, and whatever mix you have in the room before, you're going to want to kind of ignore it because the room itself is going to color the way that the recording sounds. So if you are doing it live and you're in that room, have whatever output signal you're sending to the live stream, be sure that that's what you're monitoring with your headphones. If you're mixing to a live room versus a full room, and depending on how big your congregation normally is, you're going to end up finding out that depending on the acoustics of the room, you're probably either going to have more reverb coming in that you didn't have before, or the other thing that you'll probably have is you'll probably have more high frequencies coming through the mix. So those are the 2 things that you probably want to adjust for more than anything else. The other thing that you tend to adjust for too is the possibility of you having to come down a little bit on your gain because the room is empty. The best way I can say it is if you rehearse to an empty room, that's going to be what it sounds like without a congregation in there. But you always want to look at this point, your live stream mix or your recorded mix is the part that's important. So you want to listen to it with a good pair of headphones, preferably flat reference headphones if you can, or know at least if whatever headphones you're using. If they're bass heavy, account for that. And just know realistically that most people are going to be watching your service on a computer, tablet, or a phone. It's might be rare that they'll actually be looking at it on their TV and their stereo system. So just plan on that, that sound quality or lack of sound quality, I guess, and that level of stuff. So, I mean, you don't worry too much about, you know, the sub bass levels that you normally would have in a live service, because it really won't carry through in your recording.
Now, I would add to what Brian is saying, and what we found is in our room, we do mix on headphones, but we intentionally lower our subs in the room, because we found if we just run them at the regular level, even with headphones on, we're still hearing more low end in our ears just from the room. So if we're able to lower the subs in the room, that gives us better clarity in our headphones.
Good.
Fantastic. Thanks. Sorry, Tim, did you have a question, or do you want me to carry on?
I think Matt was getting ready to say something there. So
just thinking, if you are only recording for the stream, the other option is you can just turn off the house PA.
Mm-hmm.
Just because then what you're hearing, assuming whether you're mixing it live or just taking the stems and putting them into something to multi-track them later, depends on what you're doing with it. But definitely we can turn off the house, because the guys have got their ears in or whatever they're doing on stage. And so as long as they're happy, that way you're not getting all these reflections off the room back in again to an extent.
Exactly. Good point. Good point.
I will say on that, just because like before the stream started, Chris said everything says it depends in front of it. But the only downside to turning off the PA that I've found is that some of our musicians who we've been telling them for years to keep both ears in, and they don't want to do that. And now they've got one ear out, but there's no PA going on. They feel like nothing's happening. So one thing I'll say, especially if you're in a big room, this isn't so much an EQ thing, but just another aspect of a big empty room, is get good at knowing your songs and knowing when to mute things, because the more open mics you have in a room where there's not sound being soaked up, especially if your church has like orchestration, like string sections and all that kind of stuff, anything you can mute when it's not being used will help to clean up your mix for the mics that you're actually listening to at the time.
Okay. Well, one of the questions here on that is if you've changed your approach, and how much more, less, or what have you changed with your effects approach when you're just live streaming only? It's changed your approach at all?
I'll take that one. What I've noticed is that our room seats 1,400, and we get a good, not a lot, but just a nice amount of natural ambient sound in there. So I know where I can set my reverb levels, where, put it this way, when I listen to them through the headphones, I'm finding myself running my reverb actually higher, because I don't have those room acoustics take into account that would sort of benefit my overall sound.
Yeah, and what I tell people too is, whatever room your sound is, people are kind of used to that sound. So don't go over dramatic and all of a sudden throw a bunch of 80s style reverb on everything, right? Like our room is a gym, and it's got a long slapback delay time on it, and it's been the bane of my existence because we can't put sound treatment in there yet. But so what I do on the recording is I still put in some reverb so the vocals sound similar to what we've got, but not as much as what the room would have. So people still get the sense, because when we record, we actually record in the room as though we were doing service. So the band is on the stage, or actually we just have the one person with tracks, and they're on the stage and he's doing his thing. And I just, post mix, I'll just add a little bit more reverb in there.
Okay. Good. Matt?
I have another question on the streaming. Sorry, someone has just popped in with a question, which I think is really good. Has anyone found any, and this, I guess this is more aimed towards Zoom, but has anyone found any techniques to be able to keep the audio fidelity when streaming? So like either topping and tailing or doing something with the frequencies that maybe gives a better result. Has anyone found any of that for the streaming services?
For Zoom, we've tried it a couple of ways. There's one thing, and I think hopefully people know this. There's an option in Zoom to go to original sound, which I think sends a slightly less compressed signal. One thing, no matter what, with Zoom or GoToMeeting or any of the other streaming services that are like group chats, they've never really been designed for high fidelity. So they're all designed for voice. So what you end up wanting to do is when you send the signal to something like a Zoom or something, you want to compress the signal and you want to keep the bandwidth lower. This isn't the time to try going CD quality because Zoom will just take it and compress it down. The less the services have to compress to meet their bandwidth requirements, the better off it'll sound on your end. But you're never really going to get it to sound like what you'd see like when the CMA did their thing online with a Zoom call. You know, you're actually hearing two separate sides of a recording being done. So it'll be okay, but it'll never be great.
Right.
In a world of isolation that we have in the UK at the moment, actually a lot of it's been just teaching worship leaders who sometimes aren't technical people, but they're in their houses and we can't sit and meet them, just how some of the basic features of a desk work, understanding some gain structure when they've got a 2-channel sound card, and just what a compressor, how to set up a compressor, and what reverb is, because reverb for them will hide a multitude of sins. Because most of them, They're standing in whatever room that's badly designed for this. They're in their kitchen or living room or somewhere. They didn't plan on this. They've got whatever mic they had lying around, probably doesn't really matter what it is. They've got an acoustic guitar or a keyboard, and we're just trying to help them make something that, as I said, doesn't need to be the most polished, but the nicer we can make it sound, but it's not going to set the world on fire, but that's not the aim. It's how do we make it sound as good as possible? I've been doing quite a lot working with a couple of different churches, just into Logic and using a couple of just Logic into Zoom. And that's been working fine. Just a vocal acoustic, couple of effects, just trying to make it simple, but just better than going direct in. Just the simple little touches and nothing complicated. It doesn't need to be complicated. It just needs to be reliable.
So just piggybacking off that, Matt, great answer. We've got quite a lot of people asking about gain structures. So eliminating hiss, and other different noises. Could you speak a little bit about how to set a gain structure?
It depends on the situation. A lot of the kind of noises that people are finding is kind of related to the quality of equipment they've got some of the time. I'm slightly bored of laptop earth power supply issues in the UK, making buzzes on cheap sound cards, all of that kind of stuff all the time. Or actually just you've got an incredible mic because somebody found a Neumann mic lying around, and then you can hear laptop noise. You can hear the person hoovering 3 doors down the road. All of that, and they're going, what's these noises? Well, there's a car driving past. We can't stop any of that. I think the gain structure one, you want a good level of vocal. Obviously, you need the right level, and we don't want to peak anything. And the reality is it's more important for me on the output end that we've got a good limiter and compressor, as we were saying, so we've got the right bandwidth, and we're not trying to kill it into the front end of Zoom or GoToMeeting or whatever other platform. How are we keeping it controlled? The other thing that's also quite key is keeping the level of the vocal, spoken vocal, and the level of the worship consistent. Most people don't, in a live environment, we don't worry about that 6 dB of drop of volume because the worship's allowed to be louder. But when you're watching it on your laptop, you actually need to level it out a bit. So how do we do that better? That might mean we need to have the worship quieter or the spoken word louder, especially when you're trying to do it Zoom from 3 locations at once. How do we help support that a bit better? I don't know what other people think, Chris.
I think that's an excellent point because we've had to do that ourselves, realizing there is such a volume difference between, an 8-person band and then just the single pastor talking. So we have to account for that. That volume difference that in the room is acceptable because it's acceptable, it's understandable. But when we're hearing anything from online, I remember when I worked in radio, we had everything ran through what was called an optimon, and that was just basically a compressor. So it didn't matter how bright and energetic a song was, or if it was a love ballad and kind of soft and low, it was still right there at the same volume across the board. And that's what you have to do now in what we're doing online.
Can I say something on regarding
Please.
noise and gain structure. And this goes back to the room thing as well. A lot of times I've noticed these churches are finding out that they have noise and they didn't realize they had noise only because of the fact they're actually able to hear things in isolation and realize that their bass is buzzing all the time. They just never noticed because of how much stuff is going on in the room. And some of these churches are doing interesting things with set design to try and make the room look different. And one thing that I found is if you have some cool dimmable lighting near you, sometimes you need to be really careful what you do with those dimmers because they will cause a lot of buzzes, which will be really obvious because people are hearing it, mastered and hearing it online, and that's becoming more and more of an issue. So lighting wise, that can be very important to keep an eye on that too.
Yeah, and one thing for hiss, from a video streaming standpoint that I'm finding out with churches, so they're taking in an output out of their board and usually either wiring into an 1/8 inch or a 3.5 millimeter into the mic input on a small camcorder. The problem is they also leave the volume control on the camcorder set to automatic. So what ends up happening is when it's quiet and there's nothing going on, the automatic gain controls is trying to push that up really high on the camera, and then they get hiss. So what I've been telling them to do is, okay, either, just go ahead and switch it to manual volume control on the camera and bring down the volume. And that usually tends to get rid of the hiss on the recording or the live stream for them too.
One of the things I've been talking to people about pre-recorded worship is make it as loud as you can. Let's say you take it, you put it into some multi-track software later. It's easier to, when you come into post-compile a video, to turn down the worship than go the other way. If we try and turn it up, we are creating more noise. You have some where you've got tiny waves or you've got massive waves. And actually when people start looking at it, it's like, that's where the noise floor is coming from. So if you're recording, you obviously don't want to clip, but let's get a good amount of level into the recording. And then we can fix that later. Much easier that way than the other way around.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Good. I know we've got so many questions, and thanks everyone for asking those. So we're going to pivot here in a moment back to just some typical live questions. But on the stream question, you guys all said you have gone to using headphones quite a bit more for monitoring. Are you using typical headphones or more of an earphone, like an in-ear bud, or do you have a preference? That can be just a quick answer from each on what your preferences are.
You use flat response cans.
Okay. Matt?
I've used a whole mixture of things because the reality is everybody's computer is different. I use stuff I know. So I've got these Sennheiser ears. I just know them well. They're easy, but it really depends. I've used my Apple headphones quite a bit with some other churches just to give me something different because I'm going, what's stereotypical of what everybody's listening to it on? So even when I've done something, let's have a listen to it on a pair of Apple headphones because that might be what everyone's doing.
Right. Okay. Chad?
So if I'm mixing something in the same room, I've been using these Sennheiser IE40s. They're great. They're only like $100 and they isolate well enough for me to actually hear like what's going on with the kick drum, even though I have, like I said, in our rooms, we're wanting to keep the PA going so the band can feel the kick drum, but it's really hard to gauge the level when you have, over the ear headphones. When I mix something at home, I've been using some Biodynamic DT770s, but I also check everything against my laptop speakers because I figure that's where most people are going to be listening to it.
Okay. And Brian?
Usually, if I'm mixing, I've got my my all clear audio in ears. They're the reference model, so it's flat. The other thing I use if I'm on for a long time, the Sennheiser, I can't remember what model they are, but they're the noise canceling ones, the wireless ones. They work really good for monitoring, and they have a lot of detail. So I like them because they're nice and comfortable. So the one thing too, just for everybody to know too, is whatever set of headphones you use, make sure it's the same ones that you use every week and be consistent. Listen to regular music first to see how, quality recorded stuff sounds. And then that way you'll be able to compare it to against what you're doing in your mix. And that also tells you what your headphones are hearing, whether it's too much bass, too little bass, too much highs, or whatever. That's a good reference for you to be able to say, yeah, this is what I need to adjust in my mix to get it to sound the same way.
We were doing some interesting testing a couple of weeks ago where you make a mix sound fantastic, but then go and listen to whatever streaming has done afterwards. And suddenly the difference is like chalk and cheese. You're like, who stole half the band? Where's it gone? Somewhere between this and what appeared on that stream. So just a test stream going, okay, maybe I need to mix this more bass heavy than I thought, because now I'm listening to it, everything below 100 hertz is being stolen. So what's going on? And I think that's really key, is how do we make sure that what people are actually getting is actually a representation of what you think, because it can be the most beautiful mix in the world. But if suddenly you find that somewhere on the way to YouTube, it's getting one side out of phase with the other, you're in a whole world of pain.
So
that's
would you recommend mono or stereo streams then?
That's a good question. It depends on what we're doing. It also depends on bandwidth. The biggest problem in the UK at the moment is in isolation, everybody's home internet. Most people's home internet is not designed to do a live stream every day from your house. Disney launched Disney Plus the same day that everyone was put in isolation here. And nobody's got bandwidth. And so lots of the problems people are having is purely their internet's not up to it. Everybody goes, I've got this amazing internet, but actually the upload speed is tiny. And so it depends. Spoken word, fine. Mono, no issues. Depends on what we're trying to achieve with the band stuff. Are people actually going, I must have the best stereo experience? No, they're sitting in front of their laptop listening to something. So it depends on, again, single worship leader with acoustic guitar. Mono is fine if it's going to save you a bit of bandwidth, but it depends on what spectrum of size. What do you normally do?
Very good. Absolutely. Good stuff. Hey, let's switch to what we did before COVID-19 a little bit, and talk about just. Oh yeah, I toured my guest bedroom last week.
I was going to say I didn't have grey hair in those days.
So one of the questions here, I think that can lead us to a wider discussion is, and it also affects streaming too, though. But gain staging. What's your approach to setting up your gain stage throughout your whole audio chain? Any advice for guys that are just starting, have noise issues, or
can I just
anything that you find?
Chip into that one, Tim, because there was a question before that was asking about radio mics. So if we can also touch on how you would gain a radio mic, obviously the receiver, and then there's 3 sets of gains once it hits the console. If we can tag that onto it as well. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no.
Are you talking about a wireless? When you say radio mic, I'm guessing that's wireless, right?
Yeah, that's the UK term.
Okay, just checking. I guess I'll start on this one. Then you guys can tell me I'm wrong if they're different. But normally, what I'll do is when I first get a new wireless mic, is I'll turn it on, leave it the default settings, and see how it sounds, and have whoever's talking to them talk as quiet as they can, and then go up as loud as they can, and then go normal, and see if I clip or anything. What I'm trying to do is get the most gain out of the microphone first, right? Because it's kind of something that Matt kind of alluded to, is you can't make up what you don't have coming in, right? So the biggest signal you can have without distorting is what you want to feed into the board. Then once it's in the board, my way is kind of like Tim, I guess I'd call it almost like an old school live setup, where I try to keep all the faders at unity and adjust the gain based on that, so everything fits in the mix properly, just because it's really easy for me to grab a fader at that point. But I try to make sure that whatever the vocalist is usually my starting point in the worship side of things, to make sure that if I've got a good vocal level, everything else I can fit into the mix at that point from there. And it's just easy for me to grab a fader if I need to, and knowing where, if I have a multiple vocalist that's going up and down, I can bring the fader up above unity if I need to, and then bring it back down without having to spend a whole lot of time looking at the board. The advantage I've found out too is when you actually send that recording mix out of the board, if you're just using the main left rights, it actually sounds pretty balanced. It's not necessarily a whole lot you have to do it in post.
Well, I think Brian makes an excellent point that so much of it depends on how it's being used on stage, specifically with vocalists. And I will just say, your lead pastor, whatever the speaking role is, if you've got somebody who's very soft-spoken, you don't want to be trying to crank the gain on the board and just getting feedback, because they're just so soft on the stage, and that transmitter doesn't have the gain set properly. So if you're in one of those situations, go in on a evening and with the pastor and say, okay, go ahead and talk like you would. Let me set the gain at a decent volume on the board, set the fader at unity, and if I'm not getting the right signal, I will have them or have somebody up there on stage with them turn the gain up on the transmitter and work that way until it's giving me what I need. Because there's some things you just can't overcome on the board. You have to go to the source.
I think we see it a lot with churches where, let's say they use a lapel mic one Sunday and the following Sunday they want to use a headset. And the difference in volume into a belt pack between a headset and a lapel, and they just assume, well, it's a mic, it's got the same connector, I attach it and it works, which fair assumption, but the difference is chalk and cheese. So either you've gone, one week it's going to be super quiet, or the next it's going to distort. You've got to find a balance, or just educating people and actually, okay, let's put the headset on, let's have a look, where are our gain levels up to, where's our noise floor sitting at, and then let's try and see, okay, let's adjust it. If I shout, what does that look like? And these are just simple steps. There are lights on the side of a belt pack. You can just go, oh, we're clipping. Well, let's take 6 dB off it and have a go. And now it's not clipping. Cool. Now let's speak quietly. Is there enough floor? Where's the floor sitting for the noise? And it's a lot of that with the same with a handheld, but especially the difference between a lapel, lav, or a headset. That's a big one I see a lot. Churches who are making a lot of noise just because they're overgaining. We saved it in the scene. When we cut to this, it's on here. No, that's not going to help.
Right, definitely what I would add to Chad's comment on, comment on the lapel is make sure it's always being placed at the same place every time. Because if it's up here one week and down here the other, then it doesn't matter what you do with your gain, you're just not going to get enough. So just be consistent.
Depending on how many mics you have and what you use them for, if you're lucky enough to have a ton of microphones, know what the intended microphone, like what it's going to be used for. So if it's a speaking mic, you can have a little bit more gain on the actual microphone itself. But if you've got a female singer who will just belt like crazy, learn to hear distortion with your ears. Go up there and, before service is happening and scream in that microphone. Make sure that you've got the gain setting from top down. So I always tell people to treat your sound like water flowing through pipes. So start with your microphone, get the gain set right on there so that you're not near peaking, and you can get a surprise and still not peak, and then follow that down the signal chain. I'm a big proponent of, especially for things that are going to be shared with in-ears on the board. I like to start with the fader all the way down, set my gain so that I've got a good level, usually -18 to -12 is a good safe level on there, and then put the fader where it needs to be that sounds good in the room, and that way the people on stage aren't going to be starving for anything in their in-ears as well, because a lot of the churches I work with are small, and their board has to be for both the sound in the room, the sound online, and the sound in the in-ears, and so that's usually my approach on that kind of thing.
Good. Thank you. Speaking of the console, that leads me to a question I have up here right now.
I think Brian just wanted
Andy?
to chip in. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Brian. Did you have?
Sorry, just wanted to have a quick question on the gain thing too. What I find with a lot of my churches, when I set up the gain initially, I'll come back a month or two later, and the gain is still set the same way on the board. Gain is meant to be adjusted every time you get on the board. And that's one big contributing factor that I find out too, where our churches call me up and say, hey, we have issues with the sound quality, and we're getting hiss, we're getting distortion. And it's invariably because nobody's touched the gain control. So gain is meant to be adjusted each and every time somebody goes on that channel on that
100%.
board.
Right, absolutely. It's I come to that question as you guys are talking the gain. Before I go back to this, all of you were talking about the sensitivity on the body packs and things. I'm quite familiar. There's a lot of volunteers in this world. Is that a conversation you have and teach people about quite often?
Yes.
You have to.
Yeah.
Yep.
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 Because I imagine the assumption is it's already set out of the box.
Almost. I
And-
think people have this idea that it's all plug and play, like their computer. Well, it's on. Like, well, okay, open it up and look at the settings. It's there for a reason.
Right.
I think it depends also on the style of church, because you can have, if it's for a pastor who's just going to preach and that's all it's ever going to do, through to a musical, through to a Pentecostal gospel singer who's really going for it. And all those three things could be on the same mic, or it could be three different mics. And so you need to be able to cover all bases. Hopefully it's three different mics and you can set them accordingly, but just working with the team so they know the guy, whoever's preaching that day is always, the preach mic's always this. And for a lot of churches, that's kind of it. Maybe you've got three handhelds, but you know that this one is always for the preach because it's set to sound great for spoken word. The other two can be a bit more flexible.
Right. Anyone else comment on that one?
We do have a question just come in now that kind of piggybacks onto that, and it's someone asking, what would you prioritize when training new sound volunteers? So if someone new comes into the church and wants to learn about how to run the soundboard and how to work with that, what are the top tips that you could give to that person? Do you want to go, Chad? I can see you nodding away there.
Sure. So and like we said earlier, it depends on their previous knowledge and everything, but usually the very first thing that I would teach them is just how to use a surface layer of, here's faders and mutes, and if the worship leader asks for more themselves in the monitor, how do you do that? And those are the very surface level, is just how to use what's there and go. And then over time, I basically kind of work my way down the signal chain and talk about gain and EQ and all those kinds of things, but with an emphasis on less is more when it comes to some of the tricks that they might feel they want to hop into too quickly. But yeah, just basic operations is where I would always start, and then kind of work our way from there.
That's great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So I would go a completely different direction with that, although I think in the end we're kind of going to agree with this anyway, is start on stage. They have to understand mic placement. They need to understand how the different type of microphones work. I mean, when I started, I thought there was a vocal mic and an instrument mic. Like those were the two types. I had no idea of all the differences of the polar patterns and frequency response and all that. So getting them to understand, these are how the microphones work. These are why these mics work the way they do. This is proper cabling. This is proper miking. This is how monitors should be set up. Because essentially, if you don't have the best sound coming to the mixer, then it doesn't matter what you do with the mixer. So I say always start them on stage. So then once they get to the mixer, you talk about things like gain staging, then they understand, okay, yes, I know that the electric guitarist has his guitar turned all the way up, or I know this mic is in the proper location.
That's good.
I think I go the other way, which is kind of to start by heart, which is how do we get people, because I actually think it's easy to teach the tech. For me, how do we get people who want to be there because they want to make a difference in church, not because they're here to tick a box on a rota, or because one of the things I read the other day, I'm here because that girl in the band looks great and I don't want to go and talk to her, but at least if I do sound, I can hang out with her. What's people's reason for being there, and how do we start there? And then actually teaching them is actually you're keen, you want to be here, because people who are keen and eager will start to self-learn. They'll start to engage, they'll shadow, they'll do things that they want to do, rather than trying to pull teeth all day long, which I see a lot of churches. The sound person's there because they feel they have to be, because if I don't turn up, no one's going to do it.
Yeah, I agree.
That's a good point.
And I mean, I kind of agree with what Matt goes, is, I tell people, the interesting thing with audio, actually three portions that I see to it, right? there's the technical side, and I tell people it's like I can teach a monkey how to run a mixer. You know, there's the craft side, which is, okay, how does this mixer work, and what does it do with the music? And then there's the art side, which is the part that, you know, now you're starting to shrink the number of people that actually get it. It's like, how does that music make you feel? And how do you become part of the band when you're mixing this thing? Because that's every bit an instrument as anything else on the stage. And normally when I'm starting to train somebody, I stay completely away from anything technical. You know, nobody really understands what gain is, right? Nobody understands. They look at a board and go, oh my gosh, there's all these faders. Especially if you're on an analog board. You know, if you're on a 60% analog board, that is intimidating when you first look at it, right? And so I just always use the analogy for, it's like, okay, imagine you're trying to fill up a swimming pool, right? You have your choice of using a garden hose or a fire hose. Well, that's how the levels of sound are coming in, and you need to have the right equipment to go into that swimming pool, fill it up properly. And then I kind of walk through and say, okay, well, this is the reason for the mixer being here. It takes all these signals into the thing, adjusts the levels, and sends it back out. Once they can get that concept down, it's a lot easier than to say, okay, now let's start talking a little chunk at a time. And I just go, here's one channel, ignore everything else, look at this one channel. This is what stuff does. I don't even talk about EQ. I said, okay, you know the tone controls on your car stereo? That's what EQ is, right? And then, you know, once I get through that part, what I'll do from a gain staging standpoint is I'll say, okay, here's what it sounds like if you have the main volume fader down to, like, you know, minus 20, but you've got your gain on your channel way up. This is what it sounds like there, versus if you have the main channel all the way up at 0 or above, and you have your individual gain channel down. And, you know, you play music that they're familiar with, and you can watch a light bulb going on. It's like, oh, okay, just because I have my main fader up doesn't mean it's going to sound as good as if I had my gain set up properly on the channel. And going forward from that, then it becomes a little bit easier. And like Matt said, it's really a question of heart. I would rather have someone who wants to be there and wants to make a difference for the church, and wants to make sure that no matter what, they're doing it as good as they can do it, and has that passion for that fire to do it, than someone who's been an audio engineer for 20 years and is just doing that because.
And I think following on from that, Brian, is definitely about people who get the vision of what the church is trying to do. Who owns the value of worship in the church? Well, if that's the church leader or the worship director or whatever your church calls it, is how do we make sure that they're on board with that? Because you might not fully agree all the time with everything your church does, but you agree with the leadership and you trust them. And so how do we do that? Volume's a fun one. We have this debate all the time. But actually, I'm going back to, okay, well, the leader of my church is picking the volume. I'm doing what they ask. Whether I think it's too quiet or too loud is actually semi-irrelevant to an extent, because I'm there to serve the church. And so how do we do that? As you said, people who are eager to be there, who are on board with the vision of the church. And there are lots of churches I've been to, and there are some strong conversations the leadership need to have with some people that maybe it's a time that you step away for a few months. How do we do that? What is that? And that's tough for churches, especially when you don't have enough people on your team and you're asking some of your key people or people you think are key people to step away for a couple of weeks or period of time and actually go, you'd be much better off serving on the car park team or the coffee team or whatever the ministry is that they need to be involved in. And that's a challenge, but that's the thing we need to be doing, because if we're not doing that well enough, we might as well just be mixing an average gig in our local pub.
I would add one thing to what Matt is saying, because I think you're making some excellent points, and that is we also need to teach people where they're going to find success in what they do. So, you know, after the service and they hear people say, wow, the preacher sounded great, the band sounded great, nobody ever comes up to the sound guy and says, hey, you sounded great. Well, what that person running sound needs to understand is, look, you look at the congregation and they're fully into worship, or they're leaning into whatever the pastor's saying and they're fully involved. That's your success. And if you got a good band, if you got, you know, passionate pastor, they're going to tell you afterwards, hey, you did a great job. So you'll look for that sort of thing is reactions from people. And when they say, you know, it sounded great, and the band sounded great, whatever, that's what you on your work. So you take pride and joy in that.
Can I add to that? Because hopefully we're always learning and getting better at our craft, and you know how it is. Like, it could be the best mix you've ever done, but that snare was still not quite right, and that's especially hard for someone who's new. And so I think one thing that you have to do, kind of going off of some things that Matt said, is you have to just really celebrate the wins, and you have to create a culture where it's you're really valuing your people that you're training, and even though they could have done X, Y, and Z better, well, we'll work on that, we'll get there, but there's always going to be another X, Y, and Z. There's always something else to do. Let's talk about the A through X that we got right, and just really celebrate that and make that a place where people want to be, because so much time, that's such a stressful job to have. Someone's always going to criticize what you do, and best thing you can do is just keep moving forward and be grateful for the things that went well.
I think I come back to that phrase. I'm excited by the one person who was impacted by something on Sunday. If one person was impacted, we've done a great job. 50 people might not have loved it, but that's irrelevant. They just need to man up to an extent. That one person whose life has transformed, that's what we're here doing. And so how do we model that to a team? Because we need to model it.
Right. Brian?
Yep. And I think one thing for, I don't know the mix of people that are asking the questions. I'm going to assume that there's a fair number that are probably new to this. Audio can be intimidating. Live audio on a Sunday morning or whenever you do your thing, whether it's a synagogue or a mosque or whatever, it can be intimidating if you've never done it before. Because it's almost like you're looking at it like a zero fail option, right? I mean, if somebody in the band whiffs a chord or a singer sings a wrong note, usually it's pretty easy to cover up. But if you forget to turn on a mic or you do something wrong, there's a lot of pressure that people put on themselves. And the one thing, while you are an instrument in the band, just like the rest of the worship band, the biggest difficulty you have is chances are, you haven't been doing it for as long as the people in the band have been playing an instrument. And the other thing is, unless you have a really small mixer or you can take it home with you, it's kind of hard to practice at home. There are a lot of free software packages out there that you can use if you want to practice mixing. The mixing fundamental skills of EQing and getting things in the mix can be done with something like the free version of Audacity, where it has effects, it has mixing, and you can practice on that with music that you get. There are churches out there that will be more than happy to share their multi-track streams, which are the streams of each individual instrument that you can bring in and mix with it. So it's not too intimidating. And just real quick because I saw it, and this one's a near and dear to my heart on burnout, if I can answer that real quick. It's hard to not burn out. I live and breathe this stuff. I feel that by being blessed in being able to do what I do, and I enjoy this, but I also know that there are times where I need to take a break. And it's tough if you're the only person in the church doing this, but you need to be able to talk to the person that's over you and say, hey, every so often, I need you to watch out for me and tell me I need to take a break. And either find somebody for that week or something. But I look at it as what I do, I don't look at it as a job. I look at it as my gift and back to God. So it's my prayer kind of time that I do, and I enjoy it. And that was the easiest way I found out to not have a feeling of burnout, especially, when you're trying to do the big Easter Christmas services and you're doing 8 services in 2 days, it can get really stressful. Just as long as you have a way to de-stress after that is really key. Because you're not doing anybody a favor if you're doing it just because of the sense of duty. You won't have that passion. You won't have that spark of wanting to do it.
Right. Makes sense. Have some questions here about actual mixing. And this is really geared towards putting a mix together for a worship team. And so just quick advice on starting a mix and how to make a good worship team sound great. What you can do to build a mix easily. Any quick advice?
I would always go for the money channels, the 4 things. If you've got a full band, what do people really need? They need the lead vocals, so they can hear the words. They need the rhythm. They need something to harmonize to, and the melody. So kick, bass, lead instrument, and vocal. If you can get those 4 sitting, you'd be amazed at how many things you would think were a full band. Lots of the other things you add, the guitarists are great, but they're textures and colors. Start with your magic 4, kick, bass, lead instrument, and that. And if you only had 2 minutes of sound check, that's where I'd start. I don't know about the other guys.
Great advice.
I think that's
Yeah, I agree.
A lot of the stuff that I do is I start with my kick. I do my low end, then I work up from there. Now, the way I do that is that enables me to make sure, since I'm doing my vocals last, that my vocals sit on top. Now, that works when I'm in a room where I know the volume range I have to work with, and it's, I don't want to say unlimited, but it's reasonable. But some people are in places where they say, we cannot go any louder than this, or the neighbors start calling the police, whatever. So in that case, I say, set your vocals first, then layer everything underneath that. But yeah, get those key instruments in, your rhythm, your low end.
Okay, Chad?
So if I'm mixing for a live room, during sound check, I usually start with the drums just because they're one of the more difficult things to kind of get fitting right in the mix for the room. I do find that usually by the time I'm done and I get the vocals that I've made everything a little bit too loud. So once I'm happy with the tones of everything, I'll usually work backwards and I'll set the vocals to where I feel like they're, and again, this is for a live situation, but the vocals are loud enough to where I feel like I can sing with them and not overpower them, but not also feel like they're completely overpowering me as someone in the congregation. So I get the vocals right, and then I'll put the drums in beside them, and then I'll layer in the other elements as I go. And that usually helps me to get a volume that is great for congregational worship. So like I want the vocals loud enough to where I can sing to them. I want the drums loud enough to where I can clap to them if our church is a clapping church. And then everything else seems to kind of fall in line after I get those 2 things right.
Okay. And Brian?
Yeah, I agree with what everybody said too. And the one thing from a mix standpoint, when you're doing worship music, you want to make sure that you can hear the worship leader, right? Because everybody keys off of that. And it's not just a matter of adjusting volume to get them to sound louder. This is where learning the basics of EQ and compression can really help, because just with EQ and compression, you can push that vocalist out front of the mix to where it needs to be without having to bump up the volume. And that, I think, will, as long as you can hear the worship leader clearly, the rest of the mix fits into the mix, you'll be good. You don't want to have the worship leader like really loud, but you do want to have them sitting slightly above the mix so people can hear them clearly. And that, like I said, a lot of it is EQ and compression settings where they sit out in the mix properly.
Okay. I'm going to pass to Andy in a second, but just one quick question to everyone here, and is balancing your full band worship team to a choir or a quiet pastor. What's your approach to making sure that there's consistency across your volume level while maintaining an energy for those parts of the sermons and the performance part?
Is this for live or streaming? Because
I'd say live in this situation.
I think
is that a challenge or? Sorry.
I think a lot of the work we've been doing at the moment, where there's with a couple of churches where there's a full band, and let's say it's 15 people it's a big band on stage, and then they want to put a choir on stage. And my first question is, what's the choir here for? Bear with me here, because most of the time the choir's already on the track. So is the choir here because it looks cool on the back of video, or is the choir here because you actually want to hear them? Because if it just needs to look cool, you can put any mics in front of them because they're on the track. I mean that with the greatest respect. I'm sure they're singing amazingly, but we've already heard them pre-record this. because it's the same with some string sections. It's like, cool, I've got a great band, but this cello is now in front of the drum kit. We are not magicians here. This lovely mic is going to pick up a whole world of drum kit. I can't stop that doing that. So a lot of it's that, or let's look at, okay, positioning on stage. Let's look at all kinds of things. With a lot of gospel work, well, let's look at close miking. Let's not just do a few overheads on the choir. Let's combine a few vocals and do lots of channels. But then at least we get a angelic wall of voices, let's call it that, because then you've got some level you can go with. The problem is always going to be you're limited by the level you can get the choir. So therefore, either the band are super quiet, which is a way, perfect, turn the band runner, but then we're limited by how loud the drummer actually hits the snare drum. So it's a bit of a fight, which is where we find on the bigger things, and they really want a loud drum kit. If it's going to be a performance piece or a special piece, pre-record the choir on the track. You've already got the click and things going, so they can still sing, and maybe they're a little bit in the room, but they're not going to be able to get over the top.
That was one of the questions. Was any advice on miking a choir? So if it's, as you say, if you can pre-record, I guess that would be the ideal. But if it is going to be a live miking situation,
I think it depends on the style, because if you're doing a really beautiful piece with a string section, a choir, beautiful, very easy to mic a choir for that. We can use some nice mics and get it sounding lovely. But if it's going to be a gospel thing with a full band, well, the idea of just putting 6 overheads in front of 30 people is not going to work very well if I've got a drum kit 2 foot away. So then we'll look at the ideas. What if they share a vocal mic between them in pairs? What if I combine some things and we do some submixes of a stereo from 30 vocals? It depends on how you're monitoring them. There are lots of different ways depending on the situation. What do people think?
Can I also say, when it comes to pre-recording choir, the existing choir, like the real choir, will always sing stronger if they hear a little bit of that pre-recording coming through their monitors. It just gives them this boost of confidence, and then they'll be able to boost up more, and then hopefully you can put as much of them in there as possible. But they will, a lot of times, if they're not a huge choir, they'll sing more timidly if they don't feel like they have that wall of sound already coming at them.
And Matt makes a good point with that too, with the pre-recording the choir. I mean, recording choir or having choirs at a church to me are kind of like having the kids' performances at church for the special events. You're trying to get the kids to sing, and they're not, and you can't gain anything enough to get any kind of energy out of them. And it's the same thing even with choirs, unless they're really professionally trained choirs. And it's like, you're talking about mic placement. By definition, choir mics are hard to get everybody in there, because of normally churches either don't have enough mics or they'll end up with too many choir mics. And as Matt said, they're usually right next to the drums, the acoustic drums, and you can't have that much sonic energy and not pick them up in the choir mix. So having the choir pre-recorded is a great way to do it. And Matt, I'm assuming in England too, there's a lot of the older style churches that weren't meant for probably sound reinforcement, where the choir by themselves would sound really good, like I said, with a string section. But you put in a regular full electronic band nowadays, the choir is going to get drowned out unless you put everybody in a headset mic, which is probably really exorbitant.
Exactly.
For what they're doing.
We do quite a big gospel event a few times a year, and maybe it's 300 people choir, a big event, 300 people choir, 10 BVs and some leads. For me, we get the BVs sounding amazing, and yeah, there's a whole load of overheads for the choir, and on the string they sound really good. But in the room, am I really getting super amount of choir? No, but I've got enough BVs to be able to thicken it out to make it sound like there's a whole load of voices. So it's different ideas to come up. So everything's live. But are you really, if you're sitting at the back of the room, hearing those 300 people? Not particularly, because the reality is it's full of band. Chris, what do you think?
I'd like to know why you're not wearing a black shirt. I thought that was a requirement for anybody that talks audio. You have to wear the black. I think you're making excellent points with this. Oh my gosh. One thing that I have found that has worked somewhat with the choir is to have them line up, order up by where they're, your basses, your altos, sopranos, and then if I've got a couple microphones, I can do a little EQ work there. or at least I have people who tend to sing at the same volume together and work those accordingly. But that's more like, I think, what your choir master is able to do. And if you have to mic a choir of kids, we just add you to the prayer chain is really how it goes.
I've done some stuff recently where we gave a choir 48, all of it as all a vocal mic, doesn't really matter which one. And then it went to a submix desk that was in Monitor World that literally sent a stereo to front of house. Because at front of house, I didn't need, it could be 4 channels, it didn't matter. I didn't need 48 channels of, I needed a volume of that. So turn it into a stereo thing that then appears in the room. The challenge is coming when they all suddenly want monitoring. And it's like, no, here's an approximation of what the choir sounds like. They're not backing singers now, they're a choir. There's a big difference.
Yes.
Good.
And that could lead me to an earlier question that came in very early in the session, was someone asking, how do you build relationships with the band? So the house band, or any guest musicians that are coming into play in the church or the event. How do you deal with these people, and what are the sort of things that work for you the best? I'll go to Chad, as I saw you nodding away.
Well, first off, I think it's important that we understand emotionally how people are different in the way they react to one another, and generally, and you guys correct me if you're wrong, if I'm wrong on this, but I would say generally sound people are more introverted, and sometimes it's harder for us to make good relationships with people in the band who are usually going to be very extroverted. So for me, that's like making the effort and going and hanging out with them, trying to spend as little time behind the soundboard, when things are not happening, go in the green room, hang out, and just make relationships. And I find the more that you can relate on a personal level, even if it's something silly like what are you watching on Netflix this week, it just helps you, like when you need to make a request of them or vice versa, that it's not this cold, sterile relationship where you're afraid to talk to one another, but you've already got something in common. So when I ask you, to turn your guitar amp down on stage, it's not I'm just some faceless or nameless guy who just comes up and yells at me every time I'm too loud on stage. Like there's relationship there, that really helps out quite a bit. The other side, on a practical note, whenever I talk to someone on stage, especially with like, hey, if the drum kit's too loud, I always try and phrase it in ways of like, I'm going to ask a request of you that helps the team and not just me, because I want to be that guy who wants to micromanage everything. So like if a drummer is playing too loud, one of the first things I'll say to them is, hey, if you can play a little softer on stage, I'm going to put more of you in the PA. And so it's not like I just want you to be quieter. It's like, no, I want you to be actually louder. I just want you to be clearer sounding. And this is one way we can work together to make that happen. And then it becomes like a give and take relationship more than just a give, take kind of thing. And that's worked pretty well for me over the years.
What I would add to that is that if you're dealing with a guest musician, maybe guest worship leaders coming in, be the first person to go to them and talk to them. Don't make them look for you. Just go to them and say, okay, what kind of gear are you using? What are your expectations? Here's some things I can tell you about how our room sounds. So you're really the point person for them. And by doing that, they understand right off the bat that they can trust you.
I used to stick with a phrase that someone once told me, which is maybe Sunday for church is match day. And so on a Sunday, do everything we can to make it the best it can be. And if you don't agree, that's for Monday. You can have a punch up on Monday, park that aside. How do we focus on making that incredible? And so how are we engaging? How are we making sure, like Chad was saying, but use people's names during a sound check. Make the band feel like you know who they are and you're intentionally talking to them, not, or you singer on the left, number 3. Because they're like, well, who's this idiot out the front now? How do we connect with them? We're all in this together. If they're going to have a prayer meeting before or after the service, go and engage with it. Go and be as if you're the extra member of the band, because you are. They can't really do anything without you.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I use is get your rear out of the gear. And I tell the guys, like, the folks, like, get in with the band. Get up on stage, listen to what they're hearing, invite them back to the booth, especially during the practice so that they can hear. If you have a problem with a guitarist who's got an overly loud on-stage amp, have somebody else play at the volume that he's playing at, and have him or her come out to where you are and listen and say, hey, this is what I'm hearing. This is the reason why we want to turn something down. I joke around with the band a lot. They know I have their back. They know I'm going to make things sound as good as possible for them. And I give them that commitment. And I tell the people with guest worship, it's like, this is, hi, I'm Brian. I'm your sound engineer. What do you like in your mix? How do you like your vocal sound? Guitarists love it when what kind of tone would you like? Tell me the type of tone that you like, especially with electric guitarists. They live and die by the tone that they get in their guitar, right? They know, and they're always nervous about what they're going to hear on the mix. So if you ask them the question, they're realizing that you're looking out for their best interests. And get along with the people outside of worship. Get to know them. Go to when all this is over. So one thing I miss is getting together with my worship team and going out and having coffee or breakfast or something with them, and just get to know them on a personal basis. Like Matt said too, is I pray for our worship team as often as I can on a Sunday morning before service starts. Is I'm the one that prays over the worship team, and they appreciate that. And so, once you get that camaraderie going, both sides also end up becoming a little bit more forgiving of mistakes happen. And it's a beautiful thing when the worship and tech team meld together. It's bigger than the sum of the whole.
That's some great tips there. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. There's a couple of technical questions, and Brian, as you just finished, one of these has been directed towards you. So someone is asking, could you elaborate on creating a space in the mix by using EQs? They're struggling because they have 3 vocalists, a nod, a drum kit, a bass, and a guitar, but they're having trouble with the vocals out front sounding too harsh. Is there any little tips that you could give this person?
Yeah, and I'll invite everybody else to join in too, because I've got a little bit of knowledge, and then everybody else has some other things. So if you have 3 vocalists or 3 instruments that are the same or anything, what you're trying to do in a mix is you're trying to notch out space for everyone to be able to sound distinct. So say you have 3 female vocalists that independently all share the same vocal range of frequencies. They all sound similar. Well, unless you're intentionally trying to get them to sound like one person on the mix, your chances are you're going to tend to notch out certain frequencies for different people, so that each one of them as a whole, then all 3 of them can function as 3 independent instruments, if you will, into that one single mix. So vocalist A, you may notch out some 3K out of her vocals. The next one, you may bump out 1K or something. And then third one, you may bump out 500. But you're bumping out, just notching out frequencies, the same thing with guitars. If you're getting something that sounds really harsh, if you have a frequency analyzer, look at it. There's certain frequencies that'll always sound a little harsh. Sometimes you're on 500 or 800K, depending on the person talking. Sometimes around 1000K can be harsh. And, play with the frequencies, and don't be afraid to, sweep the frequency up and down and see where the harshness is.
I'd work a little backwards with that. And I would say, okay, let's just say in this particular person's setup, it's probably, say, the guitar that's clashing with the vocalist. Lower the guitar volume, set the vocalist's EQ to where it sounds good. Now bring up the guitar, and if all of a sudden there's kind of some disappearance of clarity in the vocalist, then what it means is that guitar has some competing frequencies. That's when you then go to your guitar EQ, sweep through, and notch down until you find that place where all of a sudden your vocal seems to pop out. Not because you've done anything to the vocal, but because you've notched something out that's been conflicting with it.
Chad, I saw you raise your hand there. What do you want to add?
Chris almost said exactly what I was going to say. So guitar and vocals are, especially around that 2 to 4K area, where the clarity of the vocal is incredibly important. But if you boost that, you might start to get in screechy territory, especially with female vocalists that are powerhouse. So a lot of times what I'll do, like you might have the guitar to where if you're listening to it by itself, it sounds perfect and you wouldn't think there's any problem with it. But just like Chris said, when you put it next to the vocal, all of a sudden the vocal becomes hard to hear. So what I'll a lot of times do is just a slight variation of what Chris is saying is I'll turn the guitar and the vocal up, and then I will do a frequency boost because that's just our ears hear that a little bit easier than cuts. And I'll turn it up until all of a sudden the vocal becomes very hard to hear. And then I realize, okay, well, that's the frequency that these two things are sharing. And I'll turn that down, and that usually ends up falling between 2 and 3K. And if I listen to the guitar, if I turn that EQ on or off, the difference in tone is negligible. Like it doesn't necessarily sound better with that back the way it was, but the vocal does sound much better with that guitar vocal EQ turned down. And then all of a sudden, both of those things are in harmony a lot better. So with the vocals being one of our money channels, I always start with trying to make sure there's enough clarity with them without having to boost a whole lot. And that usually starts with cutting from guitars and keyboards, sometimes tracks, to make sure that you have space for those vocals to get through without being piercing and nasally.
Thank you. That's great. Sorry, Matt.
I spend quite a lot of time trying to work with the keyboard players and just going, there is a bass player here. Please take everything you're doing and take it up 2 octaves. We love you dearly, but I've got an axe and I'll take off your left hand if you. And I'm sure that's a common game, but it's knowing the style. If we do a Sunday and it's an acoustic service, well, maybe you want the full range of the piano or the Nord or whatever they're playing that day. But then you go to something else and it's like, hold on, I've got a synth bass on the track, I've got synths on the track, I've got a bass player in the room, and you're now playing a bass part. Can you help me here? I literally don't know what to do with this. How about you take it 2 octaves up? Oh, you found a bit of the sound and range when no one else is playing. Let's fill that space instead. So I think a lot of it is also working with the band on arrangements. What are you doing to actually complement each other when you rehearse?
So good.
That's great. And there's just one quick question, and it's cropped up a few times now. How can you persuade a musician to go from using floor wedges or monitors to in-ears? What's the easiest way to persuade them? And Chad, you've thrown your hand up there, so to you.
So as a musician myself who had a really, really bad introduction to in-ears, a few things I learned along the way are, and technology these days has made this a lot easier and cheaper to do. But one of the things is make sure that if the church is going to purchase in-ears for them, or at least give them direction of what in-ears to buy, lead them in a good direction. And I'm not saying this just because this is a Sennheiser podcast, but these IE40s are phenomenal for like a in-ear that will work for a vocalist or a bass player. And again, as a bass player, the first time I used some in-ears, they were distorting like crazy, and it just was no fun. Room mics is another big helpful thing to help, make it sound like it did when you had stage monitors. And back to building relationships, like showing them that you're not just doing this because you want it or you think it's cool, but like you're actually like, hey, we're always having trouble getting your amp volume right on stage. Well, now you can have it literally as loud as you want. And like really like giving them the benefits of it and holding their hand through that initial process of like, I'm going to do everything I can to make this sound better than you could have ever gotten a stage monitor to sound. And if you can do all those things, then they're going to find the value in it really quickly.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much, Chad. I think that is, I just want to say from my side, thank you all for joining. I'm going to hand over to Tim to wrap up now, but thank you guys. I've learned a lot today. Thank you so much.
No, I'd like to say thank you as well. Really do appreciate you guys taking the time to join us today and answer questions for the people viewing. We do have quite a few questions. Guys, I may send you some questions that were popular. Maybe we can get back to some of these people who are watching today if you're open to that.
Definitely.
Sure.
And beyond that, everyone watching, please check out the Sound Academy events that are happening. We have trainings on mic technique and RF technology and recording and everything you can think of over at Sennheiser.com/webinars. So please go check that out. We'll be doing these roundtables at least once a week, maybe more. Next week, we'll be focusing on theater. So we hope you join us then. And thanks again for coming today. And thank all of you here.
Thanks.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to see more videos just like this.